"I don't need company," he said, without looking up from the net. "I need someone who can keep a house and leave me to my work." Rowena Baird set her traveling bag down on the dock planks and looked at the back of Caspian Morrow's head. She had come 11 hours by rail from Halifax and 2 more by mail boat across the November Strait for this moment, and she was not prepared to waste it on sentiment. "Then show me the house," she said. Something shifted in the line of his shoulders. Not warmth, not even acknowledgement, but a small involuntary thing, like a man who expected pushback and didn't get any, and wasn't entirely sure how to feel about that. He set down the net, stood, and for the first time turned to look at her. He was taller than she'd expected from the Reverend's description. Somewhere past 40, broad through the chest, with the weathered hands and sun-creased eyes of a man who had spent decades reading the ocean instead of the sky. He looked at her the way a man looks at a problem he hasn't solved yet, careful, thorough, and not particularly optimistic. "You're younger than I thought," he said. "You're quieter than the Reverend made it sound," she replied. He said nothing to that. He picked up her bag without being asked and carried it up the dock toward the village. Rowena followed, watching Greyport come into view around the curve of the inlet, a tight gathering of white clapboard houses and gray cedar shake rooftops tucked against the hillside above the harbor, the November sky pressing down flat and pale over all of it. The kind of place that looked like it had always been exactly this way and intended to stay. The Morrow house was the largest one on the north end of the harbor road, set back from the water by a long yard and a kitchen garden that had gone to winter brown. It was bigger than she'd imagined, and emptier than she could have prepared for. Not empty of furniture. There were chairs and a good cook stove and a parlor with a braided rug and 2 shelves of books, but empty in the way that told you things had been removed. Not moved, removed, the particular order of a house that has been cleaned of someone rather than simply cleaned. A small pair of child's boots sat on the mat inside the back door, the left toe turned inward, the laces neatly tied. She noticed them immediately. She did not say anything about them. "Wood stacked in the shed," Caspian said from the doorway. "Larder's through there. Tobias comes at 6 for the boats. You don't need to be up for that." "I'll be up," she said. He looked at her for a moment, then he left. Rowena stood in the middle of the kitchen and let herself feel the full cold strangeness of the place, the unfamiliar ceiling height, the smell of salt air through the window seams, the distant call of gulls over the harbor. She pressed her hands flat against the edge of the kitchen table. Then she took off her coat, built up the fire, and started supper from what she found in the larder. A pot of fish chowder, dense and good, the kind of thing that asked nothing of you except to eat it. Caspian came in at 7:30. He stopped in the doorway when he saw the table set, plate and spoon, bread already cut, a jar of water, and something crossed his face so quickly she might have imagined it. Something that looked, just for a second, like being surprised by a small kindness. He sat down, he ate, he did not speak, and she did not force it. When he pushed back from the table, he paused on his way to the door. "Chowder's good," he said. "Thank you," she said. He went to bed. She sat alone at the kitchen table for a while, listening to the house settle around her in the cold November dark, and she told herself the same thing she had told herself on the mail boat, when the strait got rough and she'd had to hold on to the rail with both hands. You knew it wouldn't be easy. You were right. Keep going. The first week was a careful education in paying attention. Caspian Morrow moved through his own life with the efficiency of a man who had arranged things, so that he needed nothing from anyone. He was up before light, out to the boats before she had the stove going, and he came in only for meals and sleep. He gave her a handwritten list of duties on the second morning. Household accounts, preserving, the kitchen garden's winter preparation, mending, and she did everything on the list and more, the way she always had. It was on the 4th day that she noticed. She had called his name from across the yard, from his right side, to tell him supper was on. He hadn't turned. She'd thought he was ignoring her. She'd moved closer and called again from the left this time, and he'd turned at once, and in the moment between the second call and his turning, she saw something move across his face. A small, quick thing. The expression of a man who knows he has been caught. She said nothing. She just told him supper was ready and went back inside. She thought about it that evening, while she worked through the household account ledger, which was in a considerable state. The way he always turned left toward a sound. The way he sometimes asked her to repeat things. Not from inattention, but from something more careful than that. The way he sat at the table with his left side toward the window, always. She did not bring it up. She simply started standing on his left side when she spoke to him, and she waited. On the 9th day, she found the supply contracts. They were in the desk in the kitchen, not locked, not hidden, just stored in the way of a man who kept things where he could reach them and trusted no one was looking. She had been reorganizing the desk to make room for the household accounts she'd taken over, and the contracts were there in a leather folder, creased with handling. She read them with the attention she had given to every ledger her father ever put in front of her, from the time she was 14 years old and the Halifax Mercantile was still solvent. She read them twice. Then she read them a third time, because she wanted to be sure she wasn't wrong. She was not wrong. Caspian came in from the boats earlier than usual that afternoon and found her at the desk with the contracts spread open around her, her pen in hand, numbers set out in the margins in her careful script. "What are you doing?" he said. The flatness in his voice had an edge she hadn't heard before. "Reading your supply contracts," she said. She turned in the chair to face him. "Your equipment supplier in Halifax is billing you 18% above current market rate. On the volume you're ordering, that's a significant overpayment every season." He stared at her. "Those are private papers." "They were in the kitchen desk," she said steadily. "You put accounts on my list. Accounts are accounts, Mr. Morrow. I wasn't going through anything private. I was doing the work." Silence. His jaw was tight. His hands were at his sides. "Furthermore," she said, "there's something else in here you should see." She turned the folder toward him and set her finger on a document she'd placed separately, a circular letter from Dunlop Marine Supply of Halifax, addressed to the fishing households of Greyport. She had found it folded inside the contract folder as though it had been received, read once, and put away to think about later. "I haven't decided anything about that," he said. His voice had changed. The edge was still there, but underneath it was something more uncertain. "I know," she said, "but you should know what you'd be deciding. Sit down, and I'll show you." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he pulled out the chair across from her and sat. The Dunlop Marine letter was, on its surface, an attractive proposition, a buyout offer to the independent fishing families of Greyport, purchasing their boats and equipment at what Dunlop called fair assessment value, in exchange for guaranteed employment and supply contracts. It painted a picture of stability, no bad seasons, no equipment debt, no uncertainty. Rowena walked him through what the letter did not say. The buyout clause, buried in the third paragraph of the attached terms, transferred ownership of all purchased vessels permanently. There was no repurchase option, no exit provision. The fishermen of Greyport would become employees of Dunlop Marine, working the same water on boats that were no longer theirs, under terms the company could revise annually. Caspian listened the way she had already come to recognize, leaning forward, completely still, asking sharp specific questions at the right moments. He was, she discovered in that hour, considerably sharper than he let on. "How many families got this letter?" he said when she finished. "I don't know," she said, "but from what I can see, the Norris place, the Kells household, the Fenn operation, these are all independent families running on the same margins you are, if Dunlop is circulating this to all of them." "He's trying to buy the whole harbor," Caspian said quietly. "All at once," she said. "And if enough families sell, the ones who don't become unviable, he doesn't need to convince everyone. He just needs to convince enough." Caspian sat back. He pressed both hands flat on the table and looked at the letter. She watched something working in him, not anger, or not only anger. Something more fundamental. The look of a man who has been letting things slide and has just become aware of exactly how far they've slid. "How do you know how to read a contract like this?" he said finally. "My father had a mercantile in Halifax," she said. "Before he lost it, I kept his books from the time I was 14. I know what a sound agreement looks like, and I know what a bad one is trying to hide." He looked at her across the documents between them. "What would you do," he said, "if it were your decision?" She held his gaze. "I'd call a meeting of every family on that letter and show them exactly what I showed you. Before Dunlop's man comes back with a signing deadline." Caspian was quiet. Outside, the harbor wind moved against the windows. "There's a meeting of the Harbour families Friday," he said at last. "I can put it to them." "Good," she said. He gathered the papers and stood. At the door he stopped. "You could have walked away from this," he said. "It's not your harbor." "No," she said, "but it's my kitchen table. And these are my neighbors now. That seems like enough reason." He left without answering, but that evening at supper he said, "The chowder's better with the smoked haddock." "I thought so too," she said. It was not much, but it was the first time he had offered an opinion about anything that wasn't work, and she counted it carefully. The crack in the wall came on a Thursday. She had been mending a split in the oilskin sleeve of his work jacket when she heard him come in from the boat shed, moving more carefully than usual. She looked up. His left hand was wrapped in a rag, already darkening through. "Fishhook," he said before she could ask. "Came out of the line wrong." "Sit down," she said. "It'll keep." "It'll infect," she said. "Sit down, please." He stood in the middle of the kitchen for a moment, the stubborn man, the private man, at war with the plain fact that his hand was bleeding, and she knew what to do about it. Then he sat. She got the iodine from the shelf and a clean cloth and sat across from him and took his hand in both of hers. He went very still, not from pain, she was almost sure of that. She'd felt the small involuntary flinch of someone who wasn't used to being touched, and it was a different thing entirely from the flinch of someone who expected hurt. She worked carefully. He watched her hands. "You've done this before," he said quietly. "My father's stockboy was always cutting himself on crate corners," she said. "I learned to keep iodine in the office." "Your father's mercantile," he said. "The one that closed." "The one he lost," she said. There was a difference, and she didn't bother pretending otherwise. He was quiet while she wrapped the cloth, then, "Is that why you came out here? Nothing left in the city?" She tied off the bandage and looked up. They were closer than they'd been before, close enough that she could see the particular quality of the tiredness in him. Not physical, the other kind. "I came because I'd spent 6 years accounting for other people's lives," she said honestly. "Ships I'd never sail on, goods I'd never own. I wanted a life that was mine to account for." She paused. "I wasn't looking for poetry, Mr. Morrow. I was looking for something real." He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved in his face, slow and deliberate, like a door that had been closed so long the hinges had stiffened. "My wife said something like that," he said. "When we first came to Greyport from Pictou, she said she wasn't going somewhere, she was going toward something." He stopped, his jaw tightened. "She died 3 winters ago. Fever." "I'm sorry," Rowena said. She meant it without softening it. Moira was. He paused again, longer. "She always knew exactly what she wanted. She would have had your measure inside the first hour and been entirely insufferable about it." "She sounds like someone worth missing," Rowena said carefully. He didn't answer for a moment. When he did, his voice was quiet and entirely level in the way of someone who has said a thing so many times inside their own head that it has worn smooth. "I keep thinking I should be past it by now." "Missing someone doesn't work by calendar," she said. "It just changes eventually. Becomes something you carry rather than something that carries you." He looked at her. "Has it for you?" She thought of her father. Not the father he'd been when the business failed, but the father he'd been before it, at the desk on Saturday mornings, letting her trace the ledger columns with her finger and teaching her what they meant. "It changes," she said. "That's the best I can tell you." He nodded once and stood. "Good night, Miss Baird." "Good night, Mr. Morrow." He went to bed. She sat alone at the kitchen table for a long time after, her hands still, the iodine and cloth between them like the residue of something that had shifted without ceremony and couldn't be unshifted. The harbor meeting was on a Friday evening, in the back room of the Kells General Store, the largest dry indoor space in Greyport, smelling permanently of molasses and wood smoke. Rowena had spent 2 evenings preparing a plain summary of the Dunlop Marine terms. What the letter said, what the attached contract said, and what the difference between the two meant in practice. She had written it in language anyone could follow, because Caspian had told her that half the harbor families had pulled their children from school at 12 to work the boats, and technical language was a way of making people feel stupid and agreeable to things they shouldn't agree to. She had noted that he'd thought carefully about this. It was not the reflex of a man who didn't care about the people around him. The room held 14 families. Rowena sat to one side. Caspian stood at the front, which she could see had cost him something. He held himself the way a person holds themselves when doing something that requires deliberate effort. Not because it is physically hard, but because the last time they stood in a room like this, the occasion had been a funeral. He spoke plainly. He said what he'd found and how he'd found it. Then he looked at Rowena and said, "She'll explain it better than I can." She stood up. The room listened. She walked them through the buyout clause, the employment terms, the absence of any repurchase option. Sharp, practical questions came from people who understood their own margins immediately. Archie Norris, who ran 3 boats with his 2 sons, said, "So we own nothing," she said. Nothing. He sat back with the expression of a man who had nearly signed something terrible without fully understanding it. Old Berta Kells, who was past 80 and had run the general store since her husband died in 1861, sat at the front with her hands folded. When Rowena finished, Berta said, "My husband's cousin in Lunenburg signed something like this in 1869. It took 4 years for the whole operation to go under. The company brought in their own captains, and the local men ended up on the docks rather than the water." She looked around the room. "I've been watching Dunlop's man come through here for 2 months, and I didn't like his eyes. Now I know why." Dunlop's representative, a smooth man from Halifax named Weston, who wore city boots in a fishing village, spoke up from near the door with the careful reasonableness of someone who knows they've lost the room and is trying to slow the loss. "Miss," he looked at Rowena, "I think there may be some mischaracterization of the terms." "The terms are written down," Rowena said. "I have copies of the original document if anyone would like to compare." Weston looked at Caspian. "Mr. Morrow, surely." Caspian stepped between Weston and Rowena, not with words, just with the plain physical fact of his presence, his back to Weston, his eyes on the room. The room voted it was not close. Afterward, in the cold outside the Kells store, Caspian walked beside her up the harbor road without speaking for a while. The moon was up and the water was bright with it. "You weren't planning to say any of that tonight," he said. "I was planning to if he misrepresented the terms," she said, "which he did." A pause. "Thank you," said, plain and direct. "Berta Kells did more in 30 seconds than I did in 10 minutes, she said. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but in the vicinity of one. She noted it carefully. In the days that followed, Dunlop Marine canceled their supply contracts with Caspian. Retaliation, expected and already accounted for. Rowena had spent the previous week writing to 2 competing Halifax suppliers. The better rate came in 12% below what Dunlop had been charging. She put the comparison on the kitchen table, without comment, and let him read it. "You were ready for this," he said. "I thought it was likely," she said. He looked at the rate sheets for a long moment. Then he looked at her. "You've been managing 3 steps ahead since you got here." "I had a good teacher," she said. "My father was a terrible businessman, but he understood exactly how businesses fail. That turns out to be useful." There was something in his expression then that she hadn't quite seen before. Not quite a smile, but the shape of one, the memory of one, taken down from wherever it had been stored. She asked him about his daughter on a Sunday evening. She had finally, carefully, asked about the boots by the back door, and he had told her. Clara, his daughter, who had died of scarlet fever at age 4 2 winters before Rowena arrived. She held the information quietly for a moment. Then she said, "What was she like? Not how did it happen? Not how did you survive it? What was she like?" He looked at her for a long time after that question. Then he talked. He talked for nearly an hour, and the language was precise and detailed in the way of words that have been held inside for a long time, growing more exact with keeping. The way Clara ran, he said, always with her arms slightly out for balance, like she expected the floor to shift. The way she said his name, which came out as Cassian because she couldn't manage the first sound. The way she laughed at things she found privately funny. A small, contained sound. Nothing like the enormous shrieking laugh she had for physical comedy. He talked about Moira and Clara together at the table in the evenings, Moira reading aloud, and Clara asking the same questions over and over because she liked the answers, not because she'd forgotten them. When he stopped, the kitchen was very still. "She sounds like someone the world needed more of," Rowena said. Something moved in his face, raw and honest, and she was careful not to look at it too directly, because some things need to be witnessed without being examined. Yes, he said. You gave her 4 good years, Rowena said. It wasn't enough. No, she agreed. It will never be enough. But it was real, Caspian. What was real doesn't become less because it was cut short. He had not looked away from her once during this exchange. It was the first time since she'd arrived that he looked at her without managing the distance. Just looking, openly, with everything the last 6 weeks had put between them present in it. How do you do that? He said finally. Say the true thing without making it smaller than it is. She thought about it honestly. My mother said grief deserves its full size, she said. She said the unkindest thing you can offer a person who is hurting is to tidy it up before they're ready. He was quiet for a long while. Then he got up, went to the parlor, and came back with a small painted, the kind used for tobacco with a hinged lid, dented at one corner. He set it on the table between them. Clara kept her treasures in this, he said. A button, a piece of sea glass, a drawing Moira made of a harbor seal. He opened it. 3 items as described and one more he hadn't mentioned, a small folded piece of paper, very worn at the creases. Moira's handwriting, he said. A note she left me before the storm season. She always left a note. He closed the tin and set it on the table, and did not put it away, which was new. The spring contracts, he said then, straightening in his chair. I'll need to write to the Halifax supplier. Archie Norris has asked if we can negotiate together, better rates at volume. I'll draft the letter tonight, she said. I'll sign it, he said. It should come from me. Of course, she said. They worked at the kitchen table until late, the lamp burning between them. He knew the water end of things in precise detail, which families ran which boats, who had which debts, which men were reliable and which needed watching. And she took it all down and built the rate request from it. And he corrected her on 2 things she'd gotten wrong, and she corrected him on 1. And by the end it was 1 letter that belonged to both of them, and that seemed like the right thing. When it was done, he looked at what they'd built. This is a good letter, he said. Send it Monday, she said. He looked at the letter, then at her. Rowena, he said, just her name, the way he'd started saying it after the harbor meeting, without the formal distance of Miss Baird. I know, she said, me too. He held her gaze for a moment that had the length of several things in it. 6 weeks of careful space and gradually thinner walls, and the daily deliberate choice to keep a distance that neither of them entirely wanted anymore. Then he said, Spring's coming. The boats will start going out in earnest. I know, she said. I want you here for it. A pause, not because of the contracts. I know that too, she said. Outside, the Greyport harbor was dark and still, and the ice was beginning to ease at the edges in the way that told you winter had made its last decision. Inside, the fire was warm and the lamp was burning, and the tin box sat open on the shelf where Caspian had set it, for the first time, where it could be seen. He did not ask her that evening. He did that in March, properly, in the cold morning light, with his hat in his hands, and the harbor going green behind him. Marry me, he said, the real way, not the arrangement. Yes, she said, without hesitation, without qualification. He exhaled, long and slow, the breath of a man who has been bracing for something for so long that when it doesn't come, the relief is almost physical. Spring, he said. Spring, she agreed. The wedding was small and entirely right. Old Berta Kells brought a cake she claimed was not a wedding cake but plainly was. Tobias Fenn, who had worked alongside Caspian since Caspian's father's time, and had watched the whole winter unfold with the expression of a man trying not to be visibly moved by it, stood at the back in his good jacket and could not stop smiling. Archie Norris and his wife came, and the other harbor families came, and the Reverend from Port Maurienne came down for the morning, and back up again after noon, and it was exactly the right number of people. The morning after, Rowena stood in the kitchen and listened to Caspian already moving in the boat shed outside. The ordinary sound of him present and accounted for, and she thought about the letter she had answered in Halifax in November, in a rented room with the harbor fog pressing against the window. Capable woman needed for household management in fishing community. Honest work, plain arrangement, right if interested. He had offered less than he knew. He had been capable of more than he'd believed. She had come for something real. She had found it in the hardest possible place, in a man who had closed himself around his grief like a fist, in a harbor community that had nearly signed away everything it was, in a winter that had been genuinely, thoroughly cold. She had started fires in all of them. She went to put the kettle on. Through the window she could see the harbor beginning to catch the morning light, the water going silver and then gold, the boats at rest on it, in the patient way of things that know their purpose. Caspian came in from the shed, stamping the cold from his boots, and when he saw her at the stove he stopped for just a moment. That moment, she had come to understand, was the closest he got to saying, "There you are, good." And then he came in and poured himself coffee and stood beside her at the window. Their shoulders touched. Neither of them moved away. "Norris wants to talk about the spring collective rate before the boats go out," he said. "I'll go over the numbers this morning," she said. He nodded. He looked at the harbor. "It's going to be a good season." "Yes," she said, "it is." Subscribe to Dusty Roads and ride this one all the way to the end. This is exactly the kind of story this channel is built on. Drop a comment right now and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far across this country a story like this can travel.